Hey everybody, the next project on my 1966 Lincoln Continental is going to be pulling the engine out of the car. Now this part of the project is going to be a little bit easier given some of the other projects that I did that set up for this. For example, I've already pulled out the transmission and had that rebuilt, and in order to pull the transmission, I already had to pull the full exhaust behind the exhaust manifolds. So that's going to make this a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and jump in on this part of the project now. We're now going to remove the hood, which is held onto some brackets, and those brackets are held onto a hinge. So we're going to remove the hood from the brackets first, which is held on with 2 1/2-inch bolts on each side. Now, I am doing this by myself initially, so I'm most likely going to lower this as far as possible to loosen the bolts, and then my girlfriend is going to actually help me lift this off, and we're going to store this on top of the car while we pull the motor. All right, with the hood now off, we're just going to continue taking off the rest of the brackets that are bolted onto the hinges. It uses that same 1/2-inch socket, so let's go ahead and take those off now. We're now under the car and we're going to remove fluids. So we're going to start with oil, and we're going to use a 7/8 socket to drain the oil pan. We're now going to remove the radiator inlet hose from both the supply tank and the radiator. Next, we're going to remove a series of heater hoses from under the hood. All right, next up, I'm going to pull off the smog pump. As I understand it, this might be a part that is only on both California and New York cars, but I'm going to pull this off now. And the reason I'm going to pull this off is it'll allow me to get to the bolts that bolt on the supply tank. And so in order to get this off, I'm first going to take off the pulley so that I can easily get to this bolt back here. The pulley is going to be held on with a 1/2-inch bolt, and then the actual pump is going to be held on with a 9/16. I do have 3 of the 4 smog pump bolts out, but there is a 4th one in here that's held on with a nut on the back. And in order for me to be able to get an open end wrench on the back, I'm going to remove the battery box or shield, which is held on, which looks like by about 5 8mm bolts. So I'm going to remove that now. Great, we have enough room to fit the open end wrench, so we're now going to take off that 4th smog pump bolt. We're now going to remove the radiator cap, the tube for the drain, as well as the hose that goes to the water pump. That will allow us to gain access to these supply tank bolts. Next, we're going to start removing the radiator. Now, in order to remove the radiator, normally we would have to remove these 2 transmission lines that go to the radiator, but we already completed that when we pulled the transmission from the car. So we can move to the next step, which is removing the lower radiator hose so we can drain any remaining coolant and water out of the system. All right, with the radiator now drained, we're going to remove this fuel line bracket. It's being held on with what appears to be a 3/8 bolt right here, and then the actual fan shroud is being held on with a 7/16, and there's also another 7/16 on that side. So we're going to pull that off now. All right, according to the shop manual, the next thing to do is to remove the lower radiator bolts. They're supposed to be 3, as well as 2 bolts that hold the AC condenser to the radiator. I can't see from underneath the car where to access those bolts. So this shield does need to come off in a next step, but I'm going to pull this shield off now. There's 3 1/2-inch bolts, and I'm going to see if there's some more visibility underneath here that will allow me to access any lower mounting points. And the last step before pulling up this radiator support is just unplugging this wire, feeding that through the radiator support so we can pull that out of the way. With the radiator support now removed, there is more visibility, but it's not clear where those bolts are. But it does look like there is a plate from underneath the car that we can remove that should expose the lower radiator bolts. There are about 5 1/2-inch bolts to take this off. So I'm going to take that off now to see if it exposes what's necessary to dismount the radiator. All right, good news. Removing that plate did expose the 2 1/2-inch bolts that are holding the condenser onto the radiator. So we're going to remove both of those bolts now. Great, we can now pull the radiator out of the car. And next up, we can now pull out the fan shroud. All right, there was something that was a little bit confusing within the shop manual in regard to how to remove the radiator. You'll see in step 4 circled there, it says remove the 3 radiator lower mounting bolts. And then number 5 on a car with AC, remove the 2 condenser to radiator lower mounting bolts. So that told me that there was going to be a total of 5. That means 3 on a non-AC car, 5 on an AC car. And in fact, what I believe that means is that it's 3 on a non-AC car and only the 2 that are mentioned in step 5 on an AC car, as there was not an additional 3 lower mounting bolts.
Next, we're going to remove this heater hose. The heater hose goes from the water pump, routes around the front of the carburetor, goes through a bracket on the carburetor and towards the intake. So I'm going to remove everything all the way back to the firewall now.
All right, we're now going to remove the vacuum line for the brake booster. As you can see, the brake booster is out, already removed and had it rebuilt. So we're just going to remove this now. All right, we're now over to the passenger side where we have a series of 6 vacuum lines that we're going to take off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we're going to yank those off now. The primary wire for the coil has already been disconnected, so we're now going to disconnect the temperature sending unit, and then we're going to follow this wire along the front of the motor and down, and we're going to unplug it at the oil pressure sending unit as well. Next, we're going to pull off this heat shield for the fuel pump, and there's a series of 3 3/8 nuts that mount it, so let's go ahead and pull that out. Next, we're going to pull the fan and fan clutch off of the pulley. It's being held on here with 4 7/16 bolts. Next, we're going to work on the AC compressor. First, we're going to remove the electrical connection. Second, we're going to bleed the system using a 9/16 open end. Third, we're going to remove these lines, which are held on with something larger than a 1-inch. My largest open end is 1 inch, so I'm going to use an adjustable wrench to remove these. And after that, I'm going to remove the AC support bracket, which appears to be held on with a total of 8 9/16 bolts, 3 on the front side, 3 on the back side, and then 2 underneath here. So let's jump on that now. You may have seen the correction a minute ago in regard to the backside bolts. There's those 3 bolts. It's for the idler, pulley, and bracket, so I'm going to pull that off now. All right, we got everything around the AC compressor removed. We can now unbolt the AC compressor from the bracket underneath, and it's held on with 4 9/16 bolts. Next, we're going to start on the driver's side and work our way around the back of the motor until we get to the passenger side, removing anything that needs to be disconnected. So the first thing we're going to do is take off this power steering line using a 5/8 open end wrench as well as a 3/4 inch open end wrench. Then we're going to disconnect the downshift rod. Next, we're going to loosen this power steering line. So you'll see that it's a soft line that goes back into a hard line back to the pump. So it goes from the pump all the way through the firewall to the windshield wiper motor. You did hear that correctly. The power steering pump does power the windshield wipers. We're going to loosen that up with an open end. It looks like it's an 11/16. After that, you'll see that we have some vacuum lines that come off. There's about 3 that go to the back of the motor, and we're going to remove those now. Next, we're going to pull off a series of parts for the crankcase ventilation system. So this actually looks like it could stay on the engine and the engine could still come out, but these need to come off anyways before it goes to the engine rebuilder. So this is actually held on with 2 9/16 nuts that are holding this bracket on. This line looks like it's going to take a 3/8 flare wrench to pull that off. I'm then going to pull off the regulator valve so that I can get to the second nut for this bracket, and then I'm going to pull off the rubber line that goes to the back of the block. We're now going to unbolt the regulator valve, which is going to use a 9/16 open end wrench in order to get that off. All right, next, we're going to remove the wire for the fast idle solenoid, and then we're going to just remove the whole wiring harness from here. And again, this was the wiring that was originally for the oil sending unit, temperature sensor, as well as the plug into the coil. Just want to get all of this out of the way. Just going to pull this off to the side. Next, we're going to remove the ground wire, which is bolted up to the block underneath the alternator. But underneath the alternator is a shield for the alternator. So I'm going to go underneath the car, remove that shield, and that will gain access to the ground wire so I can undo that from the block. All right, we're now under the passenger side of the car, and you'll see that this alternator shield is held on with 2 3/8 bolts. So I'm going to pull that off now. And one other thing I want to point out is this is where the engine mount is. Normally there would be a nut to remove here. However, those are already removed off my car because I removed those so that the motor would tilt a little bit more when I was removing the transmission. So that will not be part of this video, but let's go ahead and pull off this shield. All right, with the alternator shield now off, we can get to this ground wire, which is being held on with a 5/8 bolt. And then we're going to disconnect the wires for the alternator, which appears that it's most likely going to be 3 nuts holding on the wires, which is going to take a 3/8 either socket or open end wrench to pull those off. All right, we are in a good place. I firmly believe that the motor is no longer connected to anything in the car. So we technically could lift this up now. However, I'm going to take advantage of this being in the car now, and I'm going to remove many of the accessories. So I'm going to take off the alternator, power steering pump, water pump, and fuel pump assembly, potentially more. And so we're going to jump on starting with the alternator. All right, we're now going to remove the alternator, and there's going to be the adjuster nut, which is going to be held on with a 9/16 bolt. And there's also a bolt on the back side, which it looks like it's being held on with a 5/8 bolt. Then you see that there's this alternator bracket that mounts to the block, and that is held on with 2 9/16 bolts. So we're going to take all 4 of those out now. Next, we're going to pull off the upper bracket. It's for the adjustment on the alternator, and it's held on with 2 5/8 bolts. All right, next, we're going to remove the smog pump bracket, and it was already held on by 2 of the smog pump bolts that already came out, so it's just being held on now with 1 9/16 bolt to take that off. All right, with the accessories on the passenger side now off, we're going to work from the top down in the center. So we're going to first work on the fuel filter and then the fuel pump. So the fuel filter will come off. It looks like it's going to, the hard line's held on with a 1/2 inch, and on the filter side, it'll be 5/8. Once that line is off, then we pull off the full fuel filter with the 5/8 on this side as well. With the fuel filter now off, we can remove the fuel pump, which is being held on with 2 9/16 bolts. All right, next I'm going to remove the water pump, and it appears that the water pump is only being held on with the 2 bolts on this side. The 2 bolts on this side are already removed from the mounting points of the smog pump, so I believe it's just going to be these 2 9/16 bolts plus the hose that goes to the intake. If there's more, I will note accordingly. All right, there is a 3rd bolt on this side, a 9/16 bolt that's holding the water pump on. However, this power steering line is in the way, and it needs to come off anyway, so I'm just going to pull that off now to make it easier to get to that bolt.
Okay, interestingly, there's not a third bolt holding on the water pump. However, a third bolt does need to be loosened. So this power tank reservoir is held on with a bracket, and one of those holes in the bracket is for the second water pump bolt. And then there's a 5/8 bolt down here. And so by loosening that up, I will be able to then get the water pump out. All right, we're now able to move to all things power steering. So the first thing I'm going to do is take out the dipstick and reservoir. It's the only thing effectively holding it on is this bottom hose. I'm going to cut that off, and then I'm going to finish loosening up that 5/8 bolt, and it'll lift right out. All right, we can now remove two of the power steering lines. The first one's going to be this hard line that goes all the way to here. It then has the soft line that goes all the way to the steering box. And that's going to be held on. We're going to take that off with a 5/8 open end wrench. And then the second one is also going to be this one here that goes all the way to the wiper motor. And that's just going to be, both of those are actually bolted together with a clamp. It looks like that's going to be a 5/16 socket to get that off. All right, next up, we can start the process of removing the power steering pump. First thing we have to remove is the crankshaft bolt, which we're going to use a 15/16 socket on a 1/2 inch wrench.
Next, we're going to pull off the harmonic balancer or damper, and we're going to use a power-built harmonic balancer puller to get that off. All right, here's everything that we need to pull off the harmonic balancer. We have a quantity of 3 2-inch long bolts that are 3/8 that are going to hold the flange onto the harmonic balancer. We then have the adapter, 5/8 adapter, that will go into the screw. We have the puller body that's going to go over the screw. We have a 1/2 inch ratchet wrench that we're going to use to snug the adapter into the screw. We have a 9/16 ratchet that we're going to use to put the bolts onto the flange. And then we're going to use this to hold the puller body as we use the 3/8 drive and the 5/8 socket to tighten up the harmonic balancer and pull it off. Next, we're going to pull off the woodruff key, and that's going to be necessary in order to be able to pull off the power steering pump. All right, we're now ready to pull off the power steering pump, and it looks like it's being held on with 2 1/2 inch bolts. If I find any more, I will update accordingly. All right, with all the front accessories removed from the engine, we're in the final stretch of things that need to be done before pulling the motor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take anything off the motor that doesn't need to be on it when it goes in to get rebuilt. For example, the distributor, the coil. But I'm going to start on the passenger side, work my way around, ending on the top. And I'm going to start by pulling off this bracket here on the valve cover, which appears to be held on with 2 1/4 inch bolts. Next, we're just going to pull off this rubber tube, which would go to the expansion tank if it were still in the car. All right, I'm now going to pull off this bracket that's being held on with one of the 1/2 inch bolts that's holding the valve cover on. And so I'm going to take this off now. All right, moving to the front of the motor, I'm going to take out the distributor as I'm going to have that rebuilt. And I'm going to first take off this rubber vacuum advance line. It goes into a hard line, and I'm going to remove that using a 3/8 flare wrench. And then there's a 1/2 inch bolt that I'm going to use an open end wrench to remove the hold down for the distributor, and then I'll be able to pull this out. Well, the coil decided to completely break, so we are not going to be pulling that nut off, and I'm actually just going to clip this right now using a pair of dikes. Now the wire's off. All right, I put a rag inside of the hole where the distributor goes so nothing falls into the motor. So the next thing I'm going to do is remove this fuel line. And this was originally the fuel filter on this side going to the carburetor. And I'm going to pull this off. It looks like it's going to be held on with a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to hold it with a 3/4 inch open end wrench. Next, we're going to pull off the coil and these 2 brackets, which are being held on with 2 9/16 nuts.
Next, we're going to pull off this bracket that the AC compressor sits on, and it's being held on with two bolts that appear to be an 11/16. All right, now moving to the driver's side, we're going to pull off this bracket right here, and it's being held on with two 1/4-inch bolts. All right, we're now moving to the top, and we're going to start working on the carburetor. So the first thing that we're going to take off is going to be the accelerator return spring, as well as the downshift bracket control spring. And then after that, we'll be able to remove this rod that goes from the carb to the downshift bracket. And this downshift bracket appears to be held on with a 1/2-inch bolt. So we'll take all of this assembly off now. All right, next we're going to go ahead and remove this power steering bracket, and that's being held on with what appears to be a 9/16 nut. Next, we're going to remove a couple of hard lines. So there's one that's coming out of the choke area. It looks like it's being held on with a 9/16, and we'll use an open end wrench to get that off. In order to get to that, I need to pull this bracket off the choke. Now, it's normally held on with two flathead screws, but there's only one in the top, and we'll get that second one added on when we have this rebuilt. So we're going to go ahead and take off that bracket and then pull off both of those lines. And both of those lines do go down to the exhaust manifold as well. Great. We're now ready to pull off the carburetor, and it's being held on with four 7/16 nuts. All right, next we're going to pull off the carb plate and these lines are held on with two 9/16 nuts. All right, with the spacer now off, I now want to pull off the four carb studs, and as you can see, there's already one pulled out, and that's because I tried multiple methods in order to get that off. So I first used the double nut method, where you try and loosen the lower nut. That was actually just rounding out the nuts themselves. I then tried with vice grips on the part between the threads, was not able to get a good enough grip to be able to pull that loose. So I ended up getting one of these stud extractors where as you loosen, it will actually grab onto the stud. And once it grabs on, then it's able to spin out. And that's how I was able to get that first stud out. And I'm now going to use this to get the other three out. All right, with the carb studs now out, I'm scenario planning how I'm going to pull this out. Plan A is via a carb plate. Plan B is to pull from the corner of the intake here. So I am going to pull off one of these bolts. And plan C would be to take the intake off and also pull from these four corners. So I'm now going to go to the hardware store, go get some grade 8 bolts for the studs here, and get some grade 8 bolts for these corners of the intake. And then we will figure out which method we're going to use to pull this motor. All right, moment of truth. We're about to pull this out. So I've decided I'm going to use the carb plate method. I picked up the hardware necessary to bolt this plate on. Got 4 grade 8 bolts. I was able to chase down the thread, so everything's good there. So let's go ahead and get this carb plate on now. All right, carb plate is installed. Engine hoist is ready. So let's go ahead and take this out of the car. Great. With the motor now out of the car, I'm going to remove the motor mounts, which are being held on with 2 bolts. It appears to be 3/4 inch. And I'm going to take those off so I can now install a cradle to easily roll this around. All right, the engine is now out of the car and it's time to get it rebuilt. And I'm going to be taking it up to a place called California Street Machine
It's just outside of Fairfield, California. Lance, the owner there, is usually into building high horsepower drag motors for drag race cars. However, he and I spoke. He understands how OCD I am and the level of restoration I'm doing and wants to help out with the project. So this goes up to him next. Stay tuned for more content on the restoration project of my 1966 Lincoln Continental. Thanks, guys.